My dad's retired now. Used to do something pretty boring for the government, paperwork mostly. My daughter told her new boss at a company dinner, laughing lightly as she said it, gesturing toward me across the table in a way that closed the subject as quickly as it had opened it. I smiled, took a sip of wine, and let the description stand, because I'd spent 32 years perfecting exactly the art of letting descriptions like that stand unchallenged. My name is Arthur Chen. I was 68 years old at that dinner, and my daughter had just summarized more than 3 decades of my professional life as boring government paperwork. And honestly, for most of that career, that description would have been exactly what I wanted people to believe. I need to explain what I actually did during those 32 years, or at least explain it in the general terms I'm still able to discuss, because the full picture remains something I can't fully share even now, decades after retirement. I spent my career working in a specialized area of intelligence analysis, a field where the specific nature of the work required a level of discretion that extended well beyond typical professional confidentiality, into a category of information I still, even in retirement, treat with the same careful compartmentalization I was trained to maintain during my active years. I can tell you I worked on assessments that informed decisions at very senior levels of government. I can tell you the work was demanding, meticulous, and occasionally involved information whose sensitivity meant even acknowledging certain projects existed would have violated the terms of my clearance. I cannot tell you most of the specifics, and I want to be upfront that this limitation isn't dramatic reluctance on my part. It's simply the honest, ongoing reality of having held certain types of clearances during certain periods of history. There is a particular discipline that develops over decades of this kind of work, a mental habit of automatically sorting every piece of information into categories: shareable in general terms only, not shareable under any circumstances, a sorting process that happens so automatically after enough years that you stop consciously performing it, and it simply becomes how your mind organizes everything, including, eventually, information that has nothing to do with your actual clearance at all. I sometimes caught myself, even in ordinary conversations about entirely mundane topics, unconsciously applying that same careful compartmentalization, offering less detail than the situation actually called for, simply because the habit of controlled disclosure had become so deeply wired into how I communicated generally. My wife, Linda, understood the general shape of my career, though even she didn't know most of the details, understanding early in our marriage that there were entire categories of my daily work she would never fully know about, and making peace with that as simply part of the arrangement of being married to someone in my particular line of work. We raised our daughter, Jennifer, together, and Jennifer grew up understanding, in the vaguest possible terms, that her father worked for the government, doing something related to analysis or research, a description thin enough to be almost meaningless, which was, frankly, exactly the point. I never discussed the specifics of my work at home, not because I didn't trust my own family, but because the entire structure of my professional life depended on maintaining strict boundaries between what happened at the office and what got discussed anywhere else, including my own dinner table. Over 32 years, this became such a deeply ingrained habit that even after retirement, when much of the operational necessity for that silence had technically diminished, the pattern of vague, deflecting answers simply continued, less out of active secrecy and more out of sheer accumulated habit. Jennifer grew up, went to college, built her own career in corporate finance, and eventually landed a position at a mid-sized investment firm under a managing director named Richard Halloran, a serious, exacting boss who Jennifer described in the months after she started as brilliant but somewhat intimidating, someone whose approval she worked hard to earn. I want to explain something about Richard Halloran's background that Jennifer herself didn't fully know when she started working for him, information that became relevant only much later. Before his career in finance, Richard had spent several years in a government role himself, one adjacent to certain intelligence functions, a period of his career he apparently discussed even less with his current colleagues than I discussed my own career with my family. Jennifer knew only that her boss had done something in government before finance, another one of those thin, unremarkable descriptions that seems to define an entire category of people who've worked in fields requiring genuine discretion. I'd later learned that Richard had his own version of exactly the habits I'd developed, the same careful, automatic sorting of information, the same instinct to deflect rather than elaborate, built over his own years in a field adjacent to mine, though not identical to it. There's a certain recognizable quality that people from these kinds of backgrounds sometimes carry, a specific watchfulness, a particular economy of language around certain topics that others in similar fields tend to notice in each other almost instinctively, even without any explicit acknowledgement passing between them. The company dinner, where Jennifer described me as having done something pretty boring for the government, was an annual event, spouses and parents occasionally invited for a more social evening outside the usual office environment. I'd attended a handful of these dinners over the years since Jennifer joined the firm, always as a quiet, pleasant presence, making small talk, asking polite questions about people's work, offering little about my own beyond the same vague descriptions Jennifer herself had absorbed and now repeated back to her own colleagues without a second thought. Richard Halloran was seated a few chairs down from me that particular evening, engaged for most of the dinner in conversation with other senior colleagues, someone I'd exchanged pleasant but brief greetings with on previous occasions without any particularly memorable interaction between us. When Jennifer made her comment about my boring government career, I don't believe Richard was even paying close attention at that specific moment, caught up in a separate conversation at his end of the table. What actually changed the dynamic happened almost 3 weeks later, entirely disconnected from that dinner, through a set of circumstances that had nothing to do with me directly. Richard Halloran, it turned out, maintained certain professional relationships from his own earlier government career, informal connections with former colleagues who occasionally still consulted him on matters requiring a particular kind of analytical background he'd developed during those years. One such former colleague reached out to Richard about an unrelated matter, a briefing document being prepared for an entirely different purpose, one that happened to include historical references to analytical work from decades earlier, work that had, over the years, become significant enough within certain specialized circles to be referenced as foundational to later analytical frameworks still in use. My name appeared in that briefing document, attached to specific analytical work from earlier in my career, work that, while still not something I can discuss in full detail even now, had apparently become known within the narrow specialized community that would ever encounter such a document as significant enough to warrant direct attribution decades later. Richard read that briefing document on an entirely ordinary Tuesday afternoon, according to what he told me much later, and stopped cold when he reached my name, initially assuming it must be a coincidence, a different Arthur Chen entirely, since the idea that this specific name belonged to his employee's unremarkable, boring government retiree father seemed on its face almost absurd. He described sitting there for several minutes, reading the surrounding context twice, cross-referencing the timeline against what little he actually knew about Jennifer's father, doing the mental arithmetic that any careful analyst instinctively performs when a pattern seems too specific to dismiss as coincidence. He mentioned it, cautiously, to the former colleague who'd sent him the document, asking simply whether they knew anything about this particular Arthur Chen, whether it might possibly be a common enough name that the connection was coincidental. His colleague, as it turned out, had actually worked adjacent to some of my later projects, and confirmed, with some surprise of his own once he understood the context Richard was asking from, that yes, there was only one Arthur Chen who would have been associated with that specific body of work, and provided enough general biographical detail, age range, general career timeline, that Richard became increasingly confident he wasn't looking at a coincidence at all. Richard told me much later that the strangest part of the whole experience wasn't discovering the connection itself, but the peculiar sensation of realizing that a name he'd seen attached to serious, consequential work in an internal briefing document belonged to a man he'd shaken hands with at a company dinner just weeks earlier, a man he'd exchanged nothing more than pleasant, forgettable small talk with.
He said it forced him to reckon, in a small but genuine way, with how thoroughly a person's most significant chapters can hide in plain sight, invisible to anyone who has no specific reason to look closer. Richard told me later that he'd sat with this information for nearly a week before deciding how to approach it, uncertain whether raising the subject with Jennifer or with me directly would be appropriate given the sensitivity inherently involved in even acknowledging that such a briefing document existed, let alone that it referenced someone connected to his firm. What he eventually did was invite Jennifer to a private meeting, ostensibly about an unrelated project update, during which he asked her, carefully and somewhat indirectly, whether her father had perhaps worked in intelligence or defense analysis earlier in his government career, rather than the vague, boring paperwork description she'd casually offered at the dinner weeks earlier. Jennifer, by her own account when she called me immediately after that meeting, was completely blindsided by the question, genuinely unable to answer with any confidence because she herself had never actually known the specifics, having simply absorbed and repeated the same thin description I'd offered for her entire life, without ever having reason to question whether it represented the complete truth. She called me that evening, her voice carrying a mixture of confusion and a kind of unsettled curiosity I hadn't heard from her in years, asking me directly whether there was more to my career than boring paperwork, explaining as best she understood it secondhand from Richard's careful indirect questioning that her boss seemed to believe my name was connected to something considerably more significant than what she'd always assumed.
I want to be honest about how I handled that phone call, because it wasn't a moment of dramatic revelation on my part. I told Jennifer, as I told her essentially nothing specific for her entire life, that yes, my career had involved considerably more than routine paperwork, that I was genuinely limited, even now, in what I could discuss in detail, and that I understood how frustrating and strange that must sound, being told simultaneously that there was more to know, and that I still couldn't fully tell her what it was. Jennifer asked, with a note of hurt in her voice I hadn't anticipated, why I'd never at least told her the general shape of things, even without specifics, rather than letting her walk through her entire adult life with a description so thin it had apparently caused her actual professional confusion at her own job. I understood her frustration, and told her honestly that the habit of complete deflection had simply calcified over decades to the point where I'd stopped distinguishing between information that genuinely needed to stay classified and information that could have been shared in general terms without any real risk, defaulting to blanket vagueness as the simplest, safest approach, regardless of what the situation actually required. Richard reached out to me directly about a week later, apologetic in a way I found genuinely touching, worried he'd overstepped by asking Jennifer those questions rather than approaching me first. I told him honestly there was nothing to apologize for, that his own background meant he understood, better than most people could, exactly why I'd maintained the silence I had, and that if anything, his careful, indirect approach to the whole situation reflected exactly the kind of professional discretion I would have expected from someone with his own history. We ended up having a long conversation, Richard and I, over coffee a few weeks later, two men from adjacent but distinct corners of a world neither of us could fully discuss with people outside it, finding an unusual kind of ease in talking with someone who understood the shape of the silence, even without access to its specific contents. He told me, in general terms appropriate to what we could each actually share with each other, some of his own history, and I found myself, for the first time in years, having a conversation about that period of my life that felt neither strained nor artificially limited, simply two professionals speaking a shared, careful language built around what could and couldn't be said.
There was something almost restful about that conversation, in a way I hadn't anticipated. The specific relief of not having to perform the usual vague deflections, because the person across the table already understood, structurally, why certain sentences simply had to trail off unfinished. Richard mentioned at one point that he rarely had conversations like this anymore, that most of his current colleagues had no framework for understanding that kind of careful incompleteness, and that he'd forgotten, until that conversation, how much energy he normally spent translating his own history into shapes palatable for people without any adjacent context. Jennifer and I had a longer, more difficult conversation over the following weeks, working through not just the specific facts I was able to share in general terms, but the deeper pattern of decades of blanket vagueness that had, I came to understand more clearly through her eyes, cost her something real, a fuller understanding of her own father that she'd simply never had access to, not because the information itself was always forbidden, but because I'd never bothered to distinguish between what genuinely needed protecting and what I'd simply grown too comfortable keeping vague. She asked me during one of these conversations whether Linda had known more than she had growing up, and I told her honestly that even her mother had only ever known the general shape, not because I didn't trust either of them individually, but because the entire discipline of my career had been built around minimizing who had access to what, applied so consistently across every relationship in my life that I'd never developed the habit of calibrating differently even for my own wife and daughter. Jennifer sat with that for a while and eventually said something that struck me as more perceptive than I expected, that perhaps the loneliest part of my career hadn't been anything classified at all, but simply the sheer accumulated weight of never fully letting anyone all the way in for over 3 decades, regardless of how much they loved me or how safe the disclosure might actually have been.
I told her some things during those conversations I'd never told anyone outside professional channels. General shapes of projects, the kind of impact certain analytical work had on decisions I still can't specifically describe. Enough that she left those conversations with a considerably fuller sense of who her father actually was and what those 32 years had actually involved, even without every specific detail being available to share. Richard, in the months since, has become something unexpected in my life. Not quite a friend in the ordinary sense, but a specific kind of colleague across decades, someone I occasionally have coffee with, someone who understands, without needing explanation, exactly why certain conversations simply can't go further than they do, and who respects that boundary in a way most people, understandably, don't have the context to fully appreciate. Jennifer describes me differently now when the subject comes up at work or elsewhere, not with false specificity she doesn't actually possess, but with an accuracy that acknowledges genuine significance without overstating what she actually knows. My father worked in a specialized area of government analysis for over 3 decades, some of it still classified, has replaced something boring, a description that's honest about both what's known and what remains necessarily still unknown even to her. If you've ever let necessary professional discretion calcify into blanket vagueness that costs the people who love you a fuller understanding of who you actually are, I hope you hear this. There's often more room to share general shape and significance, even within genuine constraints, than accumulated habit and simple avoidance tend to allow. Sometimes it takes someone else entirely, working from a different but adjacent understanding of the same kind of silence, to show your own family the difference between what actually needs protecting and what you'd simply, over time, stopped bothering to explain. 32 years of careful compartmentalization taught me how to protect information. It took a chance encounter between 2 men who'd never planned to meet each other's worlds to finally teach me the difference between protecting information and protecting myself from the effort of being fully known.